A geneticist studying Irish DNA samples noticed something odd showing up again and again in a specific cluster of results. Pale skin, almost translucent in some cases, hair so dark it looked almost blue under fluorescent light, and a genetic signature that, when traced back, refused to match the popular explanation everyone in Ireland had been repeating for 400 years. The story everyone told was about Spanish sailors and a shipwrecked armada. The DNA told a completely different story, one that reaches back thousands of years earlier and exposes something most people get wrong about where dark-featured Irish people actually come from. Let's start with the legend everyone already knows, because you need to understand it before you can understand why the science contradicts it. In 1588, Spain sent a massive naval fleet, the Spanish Armada, to invade England. The invasion failed. And as the fleet retreated, brutal storms wrecked dozens of ships along the Irish coastline. Survivors who made it to shore became known in folklore as the ancestors of what people now call the Black Irish, a population supposedly distinguished by jet black hair, pale skin, and dark eyes, passed down from Spanish blood mixing with Irish blood. It is a compelling story. It is also, according to the actual genetic record, almost certainly not where this trait comes from. Here is the first problem geneticists run into when they try to test this legend. For a trait to spread widely enough through a population to become a recognizable regional appearance, you generally need either a large founding population or many generations of consistent intermixing. Historical records suggest that the number of Spanish sailors who actually survived, settled permanently, and had descendants in Ireland was small, likely numbering in the hundreds at most after accounting for executions, deaths from exposure, and sailors who eventually made their way back to mainland Europe or into English custody. A population that small, mixing into a much larger existing Irish population, would leave only a faint genetic trace, not a visible regional pattern strong enough to define a recognizable look across multiple counties for 400 years. So if the Armada is not the source, where does the trait actually come from? This is where the science gets genuinely interesting, because the dark hair, pale skin combination did not appear in Ireland in 1588. Genetic and archaeological evidence shows it was already present in the population thousands of years earlier, inherited from much older waves of migration. Modern population genetics relies heavily on ancient DNA, genetic material recovered directly from skeletal remains found in archaeological sites. Researchers studying ancient remains from Irish Neolithic tombs, including sites connected to Ireland's famous passage tombs, have found that the population responsible for building these monuments around 5,000 years ago carried ancestry tracing back to early farming populations that originated near the eastern Mediterranean and gradually spread across Europe over thousands of years, with one major route passing through the Iberian Peninsula before continuing north into places like Ireland, Britain, and other parts of Atlantic Europe. These early farmers, based on genetic reconstructions from ancient skeletal remains across Europe, are believed to have generally carried darker hair and eye pigmentation than the light-haired, light-eyed populations that would only become more common across parts of Europe later, as certain other genetic variants spread and became more frequent in specific regions over subsequent millennia. In other words, dark hair and eyes were not an exception introduced into Ireland by a 16th century shipwreck. They were closer to a baseline trait carried by some of Ireland's earliest farming populations, inherited from a migration route that happened to pass through the same general geographic region, Iberia, that the Armada legend later mistakenly credited with introducing the trait centuries afterward. The geography lines up. The timeline does not. Then comes a second wave, roughly 4,000 years ago, when genetic studies of ancient Irish remains show another significant population shift, associated with new burial practices and the early spread of metalworking technology across the British Isles and Ireland. Researchers analyzing DNA from remains of this period found that a substantial portion of the genetic ancestry found in modern Irish populations traces back to this migration event, one connected to broader population movements happening across Bronze Age Europe at the time, long before anyone associated the word Spanish with the western coast of Ireland. So by the time you get to 1588 and the Spanish Armada, you are looking at a population in Ireland that already had thousands of years of layered ancestral history behind it, by including genetic threads connected distantly to populations that had once moved through the Iberian Peninsula. The Armada did not introduce the Black Irish look. It arrived into a population that had already carried versions of that look for thousands of years, and then, because the timing of a dramatic shipwreck made for a much more memorable explanation than thousands of years of gradual prehistoric migration, people simply assumed the trait must have come from the more recent, more dramatic even. There is a specific genetic phenomenon that helps explain why this trait became especially concentrated in certain regions of Ireland, rather than spreading evenly across the whole population, and it has nothing to do with Spain at all. It is called founder effect, combined with genetic drift in geographically isolated communities. Along parts of the western Irish coastline, certain communities remained relatively small and isolated for long periods, with limited movement in or out due to geography, economic conditions, and historical circumstances. In small, isolated populations, traits that already exist in the gene pool, even if relatively uncommon, can become significantly more frequent over generations simply due to limited genetic variation and repeated mating within a smaller group. This is a well-documented pattern in population genetics, observed in isolated communities across the world, completely independent of any foreign invasion or shipwreck. This means that in specific pockets along the Irish coast, the dark hair and pale skin combination likely became more visually concentrated over centuries, not because of an external population suddenly arriving, but because the existing population, isolated and limited in size, amplified a trait that was already present through ordinary genetic drift. Add centuries of relative isolation on top of ancestry already connected to early Iberian-linked farming populations, and you get a visually distinct regional appearance that has nothing to do with 16th century Spanish sailors and everything to do with population genetics, operating quietly over thousands of years. So why does the Armada legend persist so strongly if the genetic evidence does not support it? Partly because it is a far more satisfying story to tell. A shipwreck, desperate foreign sailors, secret unions with local families, that has drama, characters, and a clear cause and effect. 6,000 years of gradual migration patterns and genetic drift in isolated coastal communities does not have a single dramatic night you can point to. It is true, but it unfolds across a timescale that does not translate easily into a story passed down at a kitchen table. There is also a more uncomfortable historical layer worth mentioning. During long periods of English rule in Ireland, our populations with darker features in certain regions were sometimes singled out or treated as visibly different from the broader population. Attributing that difference to foreign Spanish blood gave people a tidy explanation rooted in a known historical event, rather than forcing anyone to grapple with the more complicated and far older reality that Irish ancestry, like nearly every human population on Earth, is the product of multiple overlapping migrations stretching back thousands of years, with no clean, single point of origin. When modern researchers run large-scale genetic surveys comparing regional ancestry patterns across Ireland, while what they consistently find lines up with this older, deeper migration history, not with any detectable signature pointing specifically to early modern Spanish ancestry concentrated in the regions associated with the Black Irish appearance, the genetic story is one of layered, ancient population movement, not a single late 16th century event. So the next time you hear someone explain their dark hair and pale skin by pointing back to a Spanish Armada shipwreck 400 years ago, you now know what the actual evidence suggests instead. It is not a story about sailors fleeing a doomed naval invasion and quietly disappearing into Irish villages. It is a story about farmers moving slowly across Europe from the eastern Mediterranean thousands of years before that, passing through the Iberian Peninsula, settling in Ireland, joined later by Bronze Age migrants, and then, over centuries, having certain traits quietly concentrated by isolation in specific coastal communities, long before anyone had ever heard the words Spanish Armada. The DNA does not lie, even when the legends built around it are far more interesting to tell. And in this case, the truth, 6,000 years of migration, isolation, and quiet genetic drift, is honestly the more remarkable story. It just never had a shipwreck dramatic enough to make people stop and ask what the science actually says.